London wore the winter as it wore most things, quietly, patiently. The cold did not arrive with fanfare. It simply settled into brick and slate, into iron rails and window panes, until the city seemed to breathe a little more slowly. Each evening, the lamplighters moved with practiced care, touching flame to wick as though they were tucking streets into bed. The gaslights flared and steadied. Their halos softened the corners of doorways and the edges of cobblestones. Above them, the sky held a low ceiling of cloud. Below it, the fog came and went like a thought half-formed, drifting down alleys, loosening itself in courtyards, and pooling in the hollows where the river's chill rose to meet it. In such a season, the nights were long, and the quiet hours should have been kind. Yet many Londoners, tucked under quilts and blankets, found kindness difficult to summon when the mind would not rest. In a narrow row of buildings not far from the steady murmur of a railway line, Dr. Elias Harrow kept rooms above a small surgery. He was not young, though he still moved with the measured speed of good health. His hair had begun to gray at the temples in a way that made him look as if he had been lightly dusted with winter. He spoke gently, not because gentleness was a strategy, but because it had become his habit. In his practice, he treated coughs and sprains, fevers and faintness, and all the ordinary troubles that arrive when a city presses itself too tightly around human lives. Yet lately, with the season deepening, he had found himself listening to a complaint that held no easy remedy. It came in many voices and many forms. It arrived with embarrassed smiles, with tired laughter, with eyes made dull by long nights. "I cannot sleep, doctor," they would say, as if confessing to a small sin. "I lie there, and the bed is warm, and still I am awake." Elias kept a notebook in which he wrote, in neat, careful lines, what he observed. He noted the usual: tea taken too late, strong coffee, irregular meals, a room that was too hot or too cold, the grief that cannot be spoken aloud, the worry that circles like a hawk. He suggested walks in daylight and a lighter supper, fewer newspapers before bed, a candle snuffed earlier. He mixed calming draughts from bitter herbs and milder ones from honeyed syrups. He advised warm milk where it could be afforded. He did not scold. He did not dismiss. He understood that sleeplessness was not stubbornness. It was a kind of hunger, and the mind could be as hungry as the stomach. Still, even with all his experience, he could not always coax sleep back into a life once it had been chased away. So it surprised him when, in the space of a week, a small shift began to ripple through his rounds. It did not announce itself as a cure. It was subtler than that, like the first sign of spring in the posture of a tree. On Monday, a widow who lived in a top-floor room above a hatter's shop told him, almost shyly, that she had slept through the night for the first time in months. On Tuesday, a thin young printer's apprentice, all ink-stained fingers and anxious blinking, confessed that his thoughts had gone quiet at midnight, as if someone had turned down a flame. On Wednesday, a night nurse whose shoulders always looked too tense said she had rested for 4 full hours without waking, and had done so without any draft at all. Elias listened. He asked questions. He checked for fever. He asked about meals and work and sorrow. The answers varied, but one detail returned with curious consistency, and it returned with the calm certainty of a bell that always strikes the same note. It was just after 12, they told him, again and again. 12 and a little. 12 and some minutes. They did not present it as mystery. They spoke of it as one might speak of a familiar train schedule. It happened. It happened gently. It happened on time. Elias did not jump to conclusions. He had trained his mind not to lunge at patterns like a dog at thrown sticks. Yet the repetition caught at him. In a city this large, chance could mimic design. Still, chance usually did so with more unevenness. Elias began to write down the times with particular care. A widow, 12 and 7. An apprentice, 12 and 7. A nurse, 12 and 7. A clerk in a boarding house who had once trembled with nervous wakefulness, 12 and 7. A mother with a colicky child, the baby too, quieted at 12 and 7, and slept as though the little body had finally remembered what it was made to do. Elias drew a line beneath the entries in his notebook. He stared at the line as though it might answer him. It did not. It simply remained a line, and beneath it his curiosity warmed like coals. The change was not only in his patience. Elias felt it in the building itself. His rooms were simple but well kept. A coal fire lived in the grate. The curtains were thick. The air held the clean medicinal scent of carbolic soap and dried lavender. At night, when he finally lay down, he would sometimes hear the building settle. The timbers would sigh. The pipes would murmur. Outside, a carriage would pass, its wheels hissing softly and damp. These were ordinary sounds. They did not trouble him. Yet now, threaded among them, there was something else. It was faint. It was easy to mistake for the small creak of a cooling stove or the soft tick of a watch. But Elias was a doctor, and doctors develop a talent for hearing what others miss. They learn to notice the heart's change in pace, the lungs' hidden wheeze, the quiet language of skin and breath. Elias noticed, one night, that there was a rhythm near his wall, as though the plaster had learned to speak. It came just after midnight, as reliably as the strange new sleep. He lay still in the dark and listened. Tap. A pause. Tap, tap. Another pause. Longer. Tap. The sound was delicate, not sharp. It did not strike the nerves like an alarm. It sounded more like a fingertip on wood or rain on a distant pane. It had the patience of a person who was not hurrying. Elias held his breath for a moment, then let it out slowly. The rhythm continued. It was not random. It arrived in phrases. It left spaces like commas and full stops. It suggested, with quiet insistence, that it belonged to a language. In the days that followed, the city seemed, if anything, a shade gentler in the mornings. Elias noticed it in the faces that met him on the stairwell, in the way people's shoulders sat a fraction lower. A shopkeeper who had once snapped at small delays now spoke with a calmer voice. A laundress who always looked frayed at the edges smiled when she handed over linen. These were small things. Elias did not romanticize them. London remained London. It was still cold. Work remained heavy. The poor still counted pennies, and the rich still forgot the weight of their own comfort. Yet something in the night had begun to lay a soothing hand on a few sleepless minds, and those minds, rested, returned a small softness to the day. Elias walked through it as one walks through a room where music has been playing for some time. You do not know when it began. You only know that the air holds it. He thought then of Adrian Vale. Vale was not a physician. He was not, strictly speaking, anything that could be written easily on a card. In polite company, he might be described as a consulting thinker, though the phrase did not capture his particular gift. Elias had met him months earlier through a mutual acquaintance and had soon discovered that Vale's mind moved with a different kind of light. Some minds were like lamps, bright and fixed. Vale's was like a lantern carried through fog. It did not blaze. It revealed. He noticed details that others stepped over. He listened with an attention that was almost tender. He had a quiet distaste for drama and an even quieter devotion to truth. Elias had found his presence strangely restful. Not because Vale spoke in comforting phrases, for he rarely did, but because he seemed to put the world in order simply by observing it. On the evening when Elias decided, at last, that the tapping was not his imagination, he waited until the lamps were lit and the street below had taken on its nighttime hush. He walked to Vale's rooms, which were kept in a building that smelled faintly of books and old varnish. The stairwell was narrow, and the steps creaked in a manner that felt almost companionable. Elias knocked. When the door opened, Vale stood framed by lamplight, his hair slightly untidy, as if he had been reading and had forgotten the shape of time. His eyes were clear. His face held the calm neutrality of someone who did not waste expression. "Dr. Harrow," Vale said, and his voice was low, like a page turning. "You look as though you have brought me something unusual." Elias did not smile widely. He did not need to. "I believe I have," he answered, "and it arrives, very politely, at 12 minutes past midnight." Vale's gaze sharpened, though it remained gentle. He stepped aside without haste, allowing Elias to enter. Inside, the room was warm, and there was a quiet order to the clutter. Papers stacked with care, a violin case resting like a sleeping animal, a kettle that seemed always on the edge of singing. Elias sat, and as he spoke of sleepless patients who had begun to rest, of the precise time, of the faint tapping in the wall, he felt his own mind settle into the steadiness of explanation. Vale listened without interruption. He did not scoff, he did not correct. He simply received each detail as if it were a thread worth holding. When Elias finished, the room stayed quiet for a moment. Vale's eyes drifted toward the window, where the fog pressed itself softly against the glass, and the gaslight outside made the world look as if it were drawn in pale ink. "A city that learns to sleep," Vale said at last, almost to himself, "does not do so by accident." Elias felt, in that calm statement, the beginning of something that would unfold slowly, like a blanket being smoothed. Outside, London continued to breathe. Inside, the kettle gave a small sigh. And somewhere, beyond the walls, the night waited patiently for the hour of 12 and 7. When Dr. Elias Harrow left Adrian Vale's rooms that evening, the fog seemed thicker than before, though it was likely only his attention that had sharpened. A mind that begins to wonder notices more. It notices the soft scrape of a broom on stone, the hush of a curtain drawn, the patient way a gas flame steadies itself after the first bright flutter. London was full of little sounds that people accepted as part of living, and Elias had accepted them too, for years. Yet now, he carried a new sound in his thoughts, as one might carry a new word on the tongue, rolling it silently to learn its shape. Tap, pause, tap, tap, pause. It was not unpleasant. It was not urgent. It was simply persistent, like a kindly reminder that something was being said. Vale did not follow him to the door with the air of a man sending another away. He moved with Elias to the threshold, as if they had begun a conversation that would not be hurried, as if the street and the night were merely other rooms in the same house. He asked a few quiet questions, each one precise and gentle. Had Elias heard the sound on more than one night? Had he noticed whether it came from within the building or from beyond it? Had the sleepers described anything besides rest? Any dreams? Any particular calm? Any sense of warmth or cold? Elias answered as carefully as he could, aware of the strange importance that carefulness can take on when the subject seems delicate. When the questions were done, Vale's expression remained even, but his attention had gathered into a quiet focus, like a lens turned toward a single point. "You will come again tomorrow night," Vale said, not as a request, but as a natural continuation. "If it truly arrives at 12 and 7, It will arrive whether we watch or not. Still, it is better to watch. So Elias returned the following evening, and the evening after that, as though he had taken up a small new practice. The rooms were always warm. A fire was kept low. The lamplight within was softened by shades and books. Vale's habits were unshowy. He did not pace. He did not fidget. He read for a time. He listened for a time. He made tea with an attention that suggested tea could be an instrument of observation. Elias, who had known men who mistook restlessness for intelligence, felt his own nerves settle in the steadiness of Vale's manner. They spoke only when there was something worth saying. Otherwise, they let silence do what silence does best. On the second night, Vale asked Elias to sit in different places, near the inner wall, near the window, near the narrow corridor that led to the smaller room where Vale kept his papers. The request was made without drama, as though they were arranging chairs for comfort rather than for inquiry. Elias complied, and as he moved, he realized how often sound changes with position. A creak becomes a thud. A distant carriage becomes the rush of water. A clock, heard from one angle, might seem louder than it truly is. When 12 approached, Vale extinguished one lamp and left another burning low, so that the room held a kind of half-light that felt suited to midnight. The fire clicked softly. The kettle, cooling, made a tiny settling sound. The city beyond the glass breathed and stirred in its sleep. At 12:07 the tapping came. Elias felt it before he fully heard it, as though the air itself made room for the rhythm. It was very quiet. It did not press. It arrived the way a lullaby arrives, without demanding attention, trusting that the mind will turn toward it when ready. Tap. A pause. Tap, tap. Another pause, longer than the first. Tap, tap, tap. Then a silence that seemed shaped, not empty. Vale lifted a hand slightly, not to halt Elias, but to keep the moment clean, as if even a whisper might blur the edges of what they were hearing. His head tilted, his gaze softened into concentration. "That is not a clock," Vale murmured. Elias had expected the statement to comfort him, as a confirmation, but it did something stranger. It made his curiosity feel suddenly reasonable. Clocks spoke in circles. They repeated. They held to their own predictable pattern, like a wheel turning. This tapping did not turn. It moved forward. It hesitated. It grouped itself in small clusters that suggested intention. Elias realized that he had been hearing it with one part of his mind, while another part argued that it was nothing. Now the argument faded, and in its place a kind of listening opened, spacious and patient. Vale rose and crossed the room with slow steps. He did not hurry. The movement itself seemed careful not to disturb the sound. He placed his fingertips lightly against the wall, as though greeting it. The tapping continued, indifferent to their presence and yet uncannily timely. Vale closed his eyes for a moment. His face remained calm. The only sign of effort was a slight stillness at the corners of his mouth. "It has punctuation," he said softly, opening his eyes again. "It has phrases." Elias, sitting with his hands folded, found himself breathing more slowly. The rhythm did not excite him. It calmed him. That was, perhaps, the strangest part. A mystery should have sharpened the nerves. It should have made the pulse quicken. Yet this sound, though unknown, seemed to hold a certain friendliness. It did not feel like a warning. It felt like a hand patting a pillow, smoothing a crease. Vale fetched a small notebook and a pencil. He did not begin writing at once. He listened for the shape of the thing, as one listens to a melody before attempting to hum it. The tapping came in brief clusters separated by rests that were neither too short nor too long. Sometimes there were 2 taps, sometimes 3, sometimes a single one, standing alone like a word made of one syllable. Then a longer pause, like a breath taken between thoughts. Vale began to mark the pattern on paper with small dots and dashes, though he did not name them as such. He made a dot for a short tap. He made a longer mark for a drawn pause between taps. Elias watched the pencil move, the simple graphite becoming a quiet record of a sound no one had asked for, and yet so many seemed to receive. When the rhythm ended, it did not stop abruptly. It thinned. It wandered into a final cluster, then rested. The room seemed to notice its absence the way a body notices when a hand is lifted from the forehead. Vale set down the pencil. For a while, neither man spoke. Elias felt his eyelids grow heavy, not with fatigue, but with ease. He understood now why his patients had described their minds going quiet as if a flame were turned down. It was not that the tapping forced sleep. It offered it. It offered an orderly softness, a gentle certainty in the night. Vale poured tea. The act was unhurried, as if time itself had become a kind companion. "You have heard it in your building," he said, "and it is heard in others. That suggests it is not bound to one wall. It travels." "Through what?" Elias asked, and his voice sounded quieter than usual, as though the room had trained him. Vale's gaze moved to the window, beyond which the fog made the street lamp's halo into a pale pearl. "London is stitched together," he said, "with many threads. Some are obvious: roads, footpaths, pipes. Some are less noticed: wires, old lines, things that carry messages when people remember to send them." Elias considered the word messages and found his thoughts settling on the idea with surprising gentleness. A message could be many things. It could be a warning. It could be a demand. It could be sorrow. It could be love. But this, whatever it was, behaved more like a lullaby than a proclamation. It seemed designed to meet the mind where it trembled and to steady it without argument. "I cannot imagine who would do such a thing," Elias said, "nor why." Vale did not answer at once. He turned the notebook toward himself again, looking at the marks as though they might lift into meaning if treated with enough patience. "We do not need to imagine," he said finally. "We need only observe. If it is a language, it will repeat its letters. If it is a lullaby, it will carry a logic of comfort. Either way, it is not noise, it is intention, and intention can be traced." Elias felt, then, that they had crossed a threshold, not into danger, not into agitation, but into a quieter sort of inquiry, the kind that requires kindness in the hands. Vale's interest did not feel like suspicion. It felt like care. He seemed to regard the unseen sender as one might regard an unknown benefactor, with caution, yes, but also with respect. "Tomorrow," Vale said, "we will not listen only here. We will listen where the sleepers sleep. We will let the city show us the path of its own calm." Elias nodded, and the motion felt like agreeing to a walk through a garden at dusk. Outside, the fog gathered itself again. Inside, the fire glowed softly. When Elias rose to go, he realized that his own mind had become quieter too, as though the rhythm had brushed his thoughts smooth. Vale walked him to the door, and as Elias stepped into the stairwell, he carried with him not only a question, but a sense of steadiness. The night, it seemed, had begun to speak in gentle taps, and two attentive men had decided to learn how to listen. The next day arrived with the pale steadiness of winter light, a kind of daylight that did not dazzle but simply revealed. London looked freshly rinsed, as though the night's fog had washed the soot from the air and then set it back gently in place. People moved with collars turned up and hands tucked into pockets, their breath showing briefly before dissolving. Dr. Elias Harrow made his morning rounds as he always did, though his attention now carried a second thread. He listened not only for coughs and heartbeats, but for the soft mention of midnight, for any hint of that mysterious easing that had begun to visit the sleepless. It was remarkable how willingly people spoke of it once invited. Sleeplessness makes the soul feel solitary. The smallest proof that another understands can loosen the tongue. He chose, with care, a few people whose stories felt most consistent and most gentle. It mattered to him that this inquiry not become a disturbance in their lives. He did not wish to pry at a healing. He wished only to understand it well enough to protect it. Adrian Vale, when Elias met him that afternoon, approved of the selection with a small nod that was neither praise nor dismissal, merely acknowledgement. Together they set out, not like hunters, but like quiet visitors, moving through streets where shops were closing for the evening and lamps were beginning their slow brightening. Vale walked at an unhurried pace. He looked from side to side with the calm attention of a man strolling through a gallery. He noticed a ribbon of smoke from a chimney. He noticed the way a cat stepped around a puddle rather than through it. He noticed, too, the thin web of overhead wires that many Londoners had learned to ignore, the lines that ran above rooftops and between poles like dark stitches against the pale sky. Their first visit was to a small lodging house kept by a widow named Mrs. Mallow, who had once been a sturdy woman and now looked as though her own worries had slowly carved her into a narrower shape. Her hair was pinned neatly. Her hands were always in motion, smoothing a cloth, aligning a cup, straightening a cushion that was already straight. She had sought Elias's advice a fortnight earlier for her own sleeplessness, and again for the sleeplessness of one of her boarders, a clerk who worked late and carried his work home in the set of his jaw. When Elias stepped into her front room now, she seemed relieved in a way that surprised him, as though his presence confirmed that her recent rest had not been an illusion. "I did not dare to hope it would last," she said, lowering her voice. "You know how the mind is, doctor. One good night and the next, you fear the memory of it will keep you awake." Vale listened from a chair by the hearth, his posture relaxed. He did not press her with questions. He allowed her to speak in her own rhythm. Mrs. Mallow described how, at precisely 12 and 7, she would hear a soft tapping, and then her thoughts would begin to drift apart like mist dissolving. It did not feel like being pulled under. It felt like being carried. Her shoulders, always tense, would loosen. Her hands, which often clenched in the dark, would soften. The clerk upstairs had experienced the same. Even the house itself seemed quieter, as if the walls had learned to breathe. "Does it come from the street?" Vale asked at last. Mrs. Mallow frowned gently, thinking. "Not the street," she said. "Not exactly. It's as if it's in the bones of the place, in the plaster, like someone tapping from inside the wall, but not in a threatening way, in a kind way. I know how that sounds." "It sounds," Vale replied, his voice calm, "as though you are describing it honestly." When they left, Vale walked a little slower for a block, as if setting her words into place. He took out his notebook and made a mark, then another. He did not write her name. He wrote only an address and a time, and beside it, a small notation of the sound's quality. Gentle, interior, rhythmic. Their second visit was to St. Brigid's Night Surgery, where a nurse named Clara Wren moved through the dim corridors with the quiet competence of one who had learned to do her work without waking pain more than necessary. Clara's face was composed. Yet Elias, who had watched her on nights when she came to his surgery for supplies, had seen the faint tremor behind her eyes, the tremor of fatigue that no tea could mend. Tonight, however, she looked steadier. Her voice did not catch on its own tiredness. "It is strange," she told them as she guided them into a small sitting room where a lamp burned behind a shade. because the ward is never truly quiet. There is always a cough, a footstep, a creak of a bed. But at 12 and 7, it is as though the sound changes texture. It becomes softer. The patients who have been restless stop turning. Their breathing deepens. Even those who cannot sleep seem less afraid of being awake. Vale asked where she first noticed it. Clara took them to a narrow window that looked out toward the railway yards. The tracks lay dark and still, though a distant engine murmured somewhere, like a beast settling. Near the window, old lines ran along the building's edge, and Clara pointed without knowing why, as if her hand had been guided by instinct. "There," she said. "It seems to come from there, from the wall by the window, as if the building remembers some old signal." Vale's eyes followed the line. "A building can remember," he said softly. "Not in the way a person does, but in the way a thing that has carried sound can carry it again." When they stepped back into the street, Vale's notebook opened once more. He drew, not a map in the ordinary sense, but a cluster of points connected by faint lines. Elias watched him, and the drawing reminded him of constellations. Each point was a place where rest had returned. Each line was a guess about how that rest traveled. The third visit was the quietest. It was to a printer's shop where the apprentice, a young man named Finch, lived in a narrow room above the presses. The shop smelled of ink and paper and the faint metallic tang of type. Finch's hands were stained even after washing. He spoke quickly at first, embarrassed to be the subject of inquiry, but Vale's calm presence eased him. Finch described how his mind would race as he lay down, repeating lines of text, rearranging words as if the world were a proof sheet that could be corrected if only he worked hard enough. The tapping, when it came, seemed to interrupt that frantic loop without force. It offered him a different rhythm to follow, and his thoughts, grateful for a leader, would fall into step. "It's like hearing someone else breathe," Finch said, and his cheeks reddened as soon as he said it. Not in the room, not a person, just a steady pattern. "Then I stop fighting the night." Vale asked him to show the wall where he heard it. Finch led them to a corner near a small shelf of paper. Behind the plaster, faintly, Elias imagined the ghost of a wire route, the old veins of the city. Vale pressed 2 fingers to the wall as he had done in his own rooms. He held them there, not as a test, but as if giving the wall a moment of respect. Then he nodded once, small and certain. By the time they had visited their 4th person, a lamplighter named Gideon Pike, who lived near the river and who spoke of the tapping as though it were an old friend, the sky had deepened into evening. The gas lights were brighter now, their halos thickening in the returning fog. London had begun its nightly descent into quieter movements. Doors shut, curtains drew, footsteps thinned. Elias felt a curious tenderness for the city in that hour, as if it were a great animal settling itself into sleep and needing, like any living thing, a little comfort. They returned to Vale's rooms before midnight. The notebook lay open on the table, the page marked with addresses and small observations. Vale took a fresh sheet of paper and began to draw a clearer map, his pencil moving without fuss. He placed each location carefully. He added street names and landmarks. He did not need to be precise in the way a surveyor must be. He needed only to see the shape that was emerging. Elias watched the points form a pattern, and as the pattern grew, so did his certainty that this was not chance. The points were not scattered like seeds thrown by wind. They gathered, they curved, they leaned toward something. "Look," Vale said and tapped the page lightly. The motion was so gentle it seemed to echo the sound they pursued. Elias leaned closer. The points clustered along a band that cut through the neighborhood like an old scar. It was not a road exactly. It was not a river. It was something narrower, more direct. Vale drew a line with the side of his pencil, shading it as one might shade a path on a map. "Old telegraph routes," he said, "or what remains of them. The kind that were laid down and then forgotten when newer lines took their place." Elias felt a small chill that was not fear, but awe. The city's old wires, neglected and half-remembered, had become conduits for something new, or perhaps something old that had learned a new purpose. Vale's gaze rested on one point that sat slightly apart, like a note that does not belong to the chord, but hints at the next change. "This," Vale said quietly, "is where the pattern thickens. If we are to find the source, we begin there. Not tonight, not with haste. We begin, as the sound itself begins, with calm." The room held the kind of stillness that invites listening. Elias realized that his breathing had become slow and even. Vale folded the map carefully, as if folding a letter. The act felt intimate, almost reverent. They waited, then, as midnight approached, and when 12 and 7 arrived, the tapping came again, faint and steady, as though the city itself had chosen to speak in a language of rest. Vale listened with his eyes half closed, then opened them and looked toward the folded map as if the paper were a sleeping bird in his hand. "A map drawn in sleep," he murmured, "and a path we can walk without waking the world." Elias did not reply. He did not need to. Outside, London's fog thickened and softened all edges. Inside, the fire glowed low, and the tapping, gentle as rain, marked the night not with alarm, but with invitation. The following morning felt quietly appointed, as though London had decided to lend the day a little extra composure in exchange for the gentleness it had been receiving at night. Fog lingered in pale ribbons along the streets, but it was not the heavy, bewildering sort. It softened rather than obscured. It made the corners rounder. It made the distance seem forgiving. Adrian Vale and Dr. Elias Harrow met after midday, when the city's errands were done with their briskest pace and the afternoon had begun to unbutton itself. Vale carried his folded map in an inner pocket. Elias carried nothing but a small medical bag out of habit, though he doubted anyone would ask for poultices on the particular walk ahead. They did not speak much at first. They stepped into the street with the quiet understanding of men who have agreed to follow a thought to its end, not for excitement, but for clarity. Vale led them along routes that seemed chosen for their calmness. He avoided the busiest crossings. He chose lanes where the shops were modest and the voices soft. The city's textures came to them without insistence. Damp brick that held the smell of old coal, iron railings cold enough to make the fingertips ache, the faint warmth drifting from bakeries where loaves had been pulled from ovens and set to cool. Above these ordinary comforts, the overhead wires made their patient geometry. They ran from building to building and pole to pole, sometimes dense as a spider's web, sometimes a single line drawn across sky. Many were new, part of the city's constant appetite for communication. Others sagged slightly or disappeared into walls at odd angles, relics of earlier urgency. Elias had passed under them for years without truly seeing them. Now, with Vale's map in mind, each line seemed to acquire a personality, a history, a kind of quiet purpose. Vale would stop now and then, not abruptly, but with a gentle slowing, and lift his gaze as though listening with his eyes. He did not point in a way that drew attention. He merely allowed Elias to notice what he noticed. Here, an old junction box darkened by soot, its edges dulled as if time had rubbed it with a thumb. There, a line that ran along a row of tenements, then vanished into a bricked-up opening like a sentence cut off mid-thought. At one corner, a weathered post leaned a little, and the wires anchored to it had the look of older copper, dull and tired, still performing its quiet duty simply because no one had told it to stop. "It is easy," Vale said at last, as they walked beside a small square where bare trees held up thin branches like lace, "to forget what a city is made of. We look at faces and doors and shop signs. We forget the hidden work. We forget the threads." Elias glanced up again. A pale sun shone through cloud, turning the wires into faint dark strokes against a brighter wash. "And you think those threads carry the sound?" he said. "I think they carry the pattern," Vale replied. "Sound travels in air, but rhythm can travel in other ways. A pulse can be coaxed into a line can carry it far. It is a simple idea and therefore often overlooked." They passed the railway edge, where the world smelled of grease and iron, though the trains themselves were not rushing at that hour. A few men stood with hands in pockets, talking without urgency, their voices low and drifting. A dog nosed at the ground, then trotted on, content. A small boy watched a sparrow hop along a fence with the solemn fascination of someone who has not yet learned to hurry. Elias found the scene oddly reassuring. If there were a mystery here, it was not a sharp one. It did not demand alarm. It asked only that they follow with attention. Vale unfolded the map briefly beneath the shelter of a small awning, where a shopkeeper had hung bundles of dried herbs. He compared the drawn line with the streets ahead. The shaded band on the paper, representing old telegraph routes, aligned neatly with their direction. Elias watched the pencil marks and felt a faint wonder again, the kind that rises when an invisible structure reveals itself. To think that rest might be traveling through forgotten lines, slipping into bedrooms and lodging houses as quietly as a kind thought. There was something both technical and tender about it. London, a city that had learned to be loud, was being soothed by the echo of an older technology, one that once carried urgent news and now carried, somehow, an invitation to sleep. As the afternoon deepened, they moved into narrower streets. The buildings pressed closer. The air smelled of damp wool, cooking onions, and the sweet sharpness of coal smoke. Here, the wires seemed more numerous, crisscrossing in layers. Vale's pace remained steady. He did not look like a man chasing a clue. He looked like a man reading a long and difficult sentence, taking it clause by clause so as not to miss its meaning. Elias felt his own mind adapting to that pace. It began to feel natural to walk slowly, to look carefully, to let the city present itself without forcing it. They paused near a small public garden where the grass was winter-thin and the benches held a sheen of moisture. Vale sat for a moment, not because he was tired, but because stillness can reveal what movement hides. Elias sat beside him. Across the path, a woman pushed a pram, her shawl pulled tight, her face calm. A man in a cap carried a bundle of folded cloth. The world went on with its quiet errands. Above them, the wires made their dark threads. Vale's gaze followed one particular line that ran along the upper edge of the buildings, dipped toward a corner, then rose again like a breath. "This is the direction," Vale said. "The map suggests it, but the city confirms it." "How does the city confirm it?" Elias asked, though his question held no skepticism. It held the simple desire to understand. Vale's eyes remained on the line. "There are small variations," he said. "Old lines are not perfectly maintained. They sag where they have been repaired poorly. They pull where they have been reattached. They have a fatigue to them. That fatigue becomes visible if one looks long enough. The lines we have been following share the same age, the same kind of weathering. They belong to the same system, and the points of rest cluster along that system. It is not a proof, but it is a strong suggestion. Elias nodded slowly. He found it comforting that Vale spoke in the language of suggestion rather than certainty. It made the inquiry feel honest. It made room for the possibility that they might be wrong, and that wrongness would not be a catastrophe. It would simply be another turn in the walk. They continued, and the city began to shift again, the way it always does when one crosses an invisible border. The shops became fewer. The streets widened in places and narrowed in others. There were stretches where the buildings looked older, their bricks darker, their windows oddly shaped, as if built by hands that had learned architecture through practice rather than planning. Vale's map pointed them toward an area where the shaded band thickened, where the old routes converged like streams joining into a single, slower river. The air here felt different, not ominous, but still, as if the neighborhood had learned to keep its voice down. The sound of footsteps became more pronounced. The distant call of a vendor seemed to float longer before fading. As dusk approached, gaslights flared into life one by one, and their soft circles of light made the street feel like a corridor of warm islands. Elias thought again of the people they had visited, the widow smoothing her cloth, the nurse moving through her ward, the apprentice with ink-stained fingers, and he felt a quiet gratitude that something, somewhere, was offering them relief. Sleep was such a humble gift. It required no applause. It did not announce itself. It simply came, or it did not. And when it did, it made the world gentler by degrees. Elias, who had treated so many ailments that shouted, found himself moved by this one that whispered. Vale slowed near a row of buildings whose upper floors seemed to lean slightly forward, as though curious about passers-by. He glanced up. Several old lines ran into a structure at the end of the street, a building with a blank, sealed look to it, like a face turned away. Its windows were dark. Its door was plain. Its sign, if it had ever had one, was either removed or painted over so thoroughly that only a faint rectangular ghost remained. Elias felt something settle in his chest. Not fear, but recognition. This was the kind of place a city forgets, while still keeping it in its bones. Vale did not approach the door at once. He stood across the street, under the warm halo of a lamp, and studied the building as though it were a book whose title page had been torn away. "Not tonight," he said again, softly, repeating the earlier promise, as if it were part of the rhythm they followed. "We will not force it open with impatience." Elias watched the building. In the lamplight, it looked neither hostile nor welcoming. It simply looked closed, and closure can be a form of sleep. "Then what do we do tonight?" Elias asked. Vale's gaze drifted upward to the lines entering the wall. "We listen," he said. "We listen from outside. We let it speak without demanding it speak louder." They walked a slow circuit around the building, keeping to the public street, noting where the lines went in, where they emerged, where they vanished. Vale marked these observations in his notebook with a neatness that felt almost tender. Elias felt himself drawn into the same kind of care. It mattered somehow that they did not trample the mystery with heavy steps. If the tapping was a lullaby, it deserved the courtesy given to any quiet song. When night fully arrived, they returned to Vale's rooms rather than lingering near the sealed building. It was not retreat. It was patience. In the half-light of the sitting room, with the fire low and the world outside softened by fog, Vale unfolded the map again and traced the converging lines with his finger. Elias watched that slow movement and felt as if he were watching someone follow a river back to its spring. The city, stitched with copper, had begun to dream through its own forgotten threads. And somewhere, near that blank-faced building, a heart of quiet mechanism seemed to beat. At 12 and 7, the tapping came again, as gentle as ever, and Elias noticed something new. It felt, just barely, closer than it had before, as if their day's walk had brought them nearer, not only in distance, but in understanding. Vale listened with his eyes closed, and when the rhythm ended, he opened them and looked at Elias with calm certainty. "Tomorrow," he said, "we will meet the place itself, not as intruders, as guests." Elias nodded, and in that nod there was the same softness that had begun to spread through the city. The thread of copper had led them this far. The thread of dream would lead them the rest of the way, slowly, kindly, at the pace of midnight and 7. The next day arrived with a mildness that felt borrowed from some kinder season, though the air remained cold enough to make the breath visible. London's winter did not truly soften, but it sometimes allowed small mercies, and Elias Harrow found himself accepting them with a quiet gratitude. He went through his morning duties as he always did, moving from house to house with his medical bag and his steady voice, but he did so with the sense that an evening appointment awaited him, not with illness, but with a question. The thought did not trouble him. It steadied him. Adrian Vale had a way of making inquiry feel like a form of care rather than intrusion, and Elias, who had spent much of his life tending to bodies, felt he was being invited to tend to something more delicate, a city's unseen longing for rest. When they met in the late afternoon, Vale looked as composed as ever. He had dressed plainly, as if to avoid drawing attention, but there was a neatness to him that made even plainness seem intentional. He carried no visible tools, only his notebook and a small folded scrap of the map. Elias, for his part, wore his coat buttoned high and his scarf wrapped close. Their conversation was brief. Vale asked whether Elias had heard any new reports. Elias said no, only the same gentle confirmations. Vale nodded. It was enough. They set out again, following the familiar route toward the building, whose blank face had lingered in Elias's mind since the previous evening. The streets grew quieter as they approached the area where the old lines converged. Shop signs became fewer. The air smelled of damp stone and faint rust. The fog had returned, not thick enough to swallow the world, but thick enough to make it seem more private, as though London were drawing a curtain around this particular neighborhood. Elias noticed, with a soft thrill of recognition, the overhead wires. Here they seemed older, their surfaces dulled, their angles a little more uncertain. Some dipped toward the roofs before rising again, like a slow breath. Vale glanced at them now and then, as though reading their posture. They reached the building as dusk settled. In the gaslight, it appeared even more sealed than before. Its door was of heavy wood, painted a sober color that had darkened with age. The paint was cracked in places, like fine lines at the corner of an old face. There was no handle in the ordinary sense, only a metal plate and a keyhole that looked as though it had not welcomed a key in a long time. The windows were high and narrow, their glass clouded with grime, their frames painted over so many times that the layers resembled sediment. The faint rectangular ghost on the wall where a sign had once been was more visible now. Under the right angle of lamplight, Elias thought he could almost see the old lettering, as if the words still lived beneath the paint and were waiting to be remembered. Vale stood across the street for a moment, just as he had the night before. He did not stride toward the door. He allowed the building its dignity. Elias stood beside him, and together they watched the place as one watches a sleeping person, careful not to wake them too abruptly. A carriage passed slowly, its wheels whispering on damp cobbles. A man with a bundle of kindling walked by without looking up. The building remained still, neither inviting nor refusing, simply present. "Station," Vale said softly, as if testing the word against the shape of the place. Not a railway station, a signal station, a telegraph office perhaps, something that once spoke for the city. And now it is silent, Elias murmured. Not entirely, Vale replied. His gaze lifted toward where several old lines entered the upper wall. It is quiet, but quiet is not the same as empty. They crossed the street at last. Up close, the door's surface showed the marks of weather and time. There were scratches near the keyhole, as though someone had once tried to force it and then thought better. The step before the door held a thin layer of soot mixed with rain-damp grit. Elias felt an urge to brush it away, not for any practical reason, but out of a sense of courtesy. Vale did not touch the door immediately. Instead, he leaned slightly and looked along the edge, where door met frame, studying the seams, the faint gaps, the way the wood swelled and shrank with seasons. It has not been opened recently, Vale said, but it has not been abandoned by the world. There are tracks, light ones, not of many feet, of careful feet. Elias looked down. At first, he saw only the usual city dirt. Then, with attention guided, he noticed the faint impressions, a shoe sole pattern, partial and delicate, as if someone approached only now and then. The marks did not look hurried. They looked measured, like steps taken by someone who did not wish to be seen and did not wish to disturb. Vale took out a thin piece of metal from his pocket, no larger than a hairpin. Elias recognized it as the kind of simple tool a man might carry for practical purposes, not as a weapon. Vale held it thoughtfully between his fingers, then slipped it back into his pocket. The gesture was telling. He could attempt the lock, perhaps. He could test the mechanism, but he chose not to. There is a better way, he said quietly. He moved along the building's side, following the wall toward a narrow alley. Elias followed. The alley was damp and smelled faintly of old wood. A drainage pipe ran down one corner. The brick here was darker, sheltered from direct rain, but stained by years of smoke. Vale paused near a small, low window that was partly covered by a wooden board. The board was nailed on two sides, but one edge had loosened. Elias could see the faintest gap, just enough to suggest air might move in and out. Vale crouched, not in haste, but with the careful patience of a man kneeling to examine a wildflower. He tested the board with gentle pressure. It shifted slightly, whispering against the nails. He did not pry it. He did not force it. He merely confirmed that it could be moved, and then he stopped. "We could enter," Elias said, his voice low. "We could," Vale agreed, "but we will not enter like thieves. We will announce ourselves, even if no one answers." Elias felt the sense in that. If this place contained the source of the lullaby, it deserved respect. A kindness done in secret was still kindness, but it could be bruised by suspicion. Vale seemed determined that whatever was within would not be startled into silence. He rose and returned to the door. In the lamplight, he looked almost like a minister, preparing to knock on a parishioner's door, not with judgment, but with a gentle duty. He lifted his hand and knocked once, softly. The sound was surprisingly loud in the quiet street. He waited. Then he knocked again, the same careful pressure. For a long moment, nothing happened. Elias heard only the distant hum of the city and the quiet drip of water somewhere nearby. He wondered if they had misread everything. Perhaps the building was truly empty. Perhaps the tapping came from elsewhere, traveling through the wires but not originating here. Then, as he listened, he heard it. The faintest internal sound, like the settling of a chair on floorboards or the shift of cloth. It was so slight it might have been imagined, but Vale's gaze sharpened, suggesting he had heard it too. Vale spoke, not loudly, but clearly, as though addressing someone on the other side of a curtain. "We have come in peace," he said. "We have come with respect. We have been listening to what the city hears at night, and we believe it begins here. We wish only to understand." Silence again. Then, very faintly, a sound at the keyhole, a soft metallic whisper. Elias held his breath. The lock turned with reluctance, like a joint that had not moved in a long time. The door did not swing wide. It opened only a crack, enough for a sliver of darkness to appear between door and frame. A voice emerged, older and low, carrying the soft caution of someone who has lived quietly for too long. "Understanding," it said, as if tasting the word. "It is a dangerous appetite." Vale did not step forward. He kept his hands visible, relaxed at his sides. "It can be," he said, "but it can also be gentle. We have no desire to harm what you are doing. In truth, we believe it has helped people." The crack widened slightly. Elias could see nothing of the speaker, only darkness and the faint outline of a shoulder. A smell drifted out: dust, old paper, cold metal, and something faintly sweet like dried lavender or old soap. It was a scent that made Elias think of forgotten drawers and carefully kept letters. "You are not police," the voice said, not accusingly but cautiously. "No," Vale answered. "We are simply two men who have been paying attention." Another pause. Then the door opened a fraction more, enough for lamplight to slip into the interior and reveal a narrow entryway. The floorboards inside were worn smooth by years of footsteps. The walls were lined with faded notices, their edges curled. A tall clock stood in one corner, its face pale, its hands stopped. Beyond the entryway, Elias glimpsed a room full of shapes, tables, shelves, a tangle of wires perhaps, though the dimness made it hard to tell. The air inside was colder than the street, as if the building held onto its own season. "You may come in," the voice said at last, "but quietly, quietly, as it is done here." Vale nodded once, solemnly, as though accepting a sacred rule. He stepped over the threshold with measured care. Elias followed, feeling as if he were entering not a hidden den, but an old chapel. The door shut behind them with a soft final sound, and for a moment, Elias stood in darkness with only the faint spill of streetlight fading at the edges. Then, from deeper within the building, there came the gentlest of mechanical ticks, steady and calm. It was not the tapping they heard at midnight, but it carried the same quality of intention. It sounded like patience made audible. Vale's voice was very low when he spoke again. "Station M," he murmured, reading the faint letter stenciled on a wall plaque half obscured by dust. "So it is called." Elias traced the letter with his eyes. The building, sealed to the city's glance, had let them in. Inside, stillness gathered like a blanket. The faint ticking continued, and Elias felt, not excitement, but a quiet sense of arrival. Something here had been waiting, and now, at last, it had been heard. Inside Station M, the air held a particular stillness, as if the building had been instructed long ago to keep its voice down and had never forgotten. The darkness was not heavy, only deep, softened by the faintest spill of lamplight that had followed them in before the door closed. Adrian Vale paused, allowing his eyes to adjust, and Dr. Elias Harrow stood beside him with the instinctive patience of a physician waiting for a pulse to settle. The interior smelled of old paper and cooled metal, with a thread of something clean beneath it, like lavender dried carefully and tucked into drawers. A narrow corridor opened ahead, and from somewhere deeper within came the quiet mechanical ticking Elias had noticed at once. It was steady. It was not hurried. It sounded like a clock that had been built for reassurance rather than precision. The unseen host moved ahead of them, with measured steps, as if guiding them through a sleeping house. He did not strike a match or light a lamp at once, and Elias understood the choice. Too much light would have felt like interrogation. This place did not want interrogation. It wanted courtesy. Vale followed without pressing, his hands relaxed at his sides, his gaze attentive to the outlines of things. A wall plaque with the faint letter M, a row of hooks where coats might once have hung, a set of notices pinned and repinned until the paper had grown soft at the corners. The host's voice came again, low and even. "Mind the step," he said, and indeed the floor dipped slightly where the boards had settled over years. Elias stepped carefully. A small kindness in the warning made him feel that, whatever lay at the heart of Station M, it was tended by someone who understood gentleness as a discipline. They entered the main room, and the host finally lit a single lamp on a table near the center. The light was modest. The flame turned down so that its glow pooled rather than flooded. In that warm circle, the room revealed itself in quiet layers. There were desks arranged like stations along a long counter, each with the worn imprint of elbows and hands. There were shelves lined with ledgers, their spines dulled, their titles faded. In one corner stood a telegraph sounder and key, the brass darkened by touch and time. Along the walls ran a neat arrangement of wires and ceramic insulators, some disconnected, some still threaded through in careful order. Elias felt the gentle weight of history here, not the grand kind, but the kind made from repeated nights of work, from messages sent and received, from lives touched at a distance by small clicks and taps. Vale's attention moved immediately to the apparatus in the corner, not with excitement, but with recognition. He approached it slowly, as though it were an animal that might be startled by sudden movement. The host watched him, his posture guarded but not hostile. In the lamplight, Elias could see him more clearly now. An older man, spare in build, his hair pale and thin, his face lined in the way faces become when they have spent many years listening. His eyes were steady. There was caution in them, but also a quiet weariness, as though he had carried a long responsibility and had not expected anyone to come asking about it. "You know what it is," the host said, and it was not quite a question. "I know what it was made to do," Vale replied gently. "I do not yet know what you have taught it to do now." The older man's mouth softened, just slightly, as if a smile had once lived there and might return if conditions were safe enough. He did not answer. Instead, he gestured toward the telegraph key. "It speaks," he said, "if you listen properly, if you do not rush it." Vale nodded and took out the notebook in which he had recorded the midnight pattern. He set it on the desk beside the telegraph key, careful not to disturb anything. Elias stood a little behind him, close enough to see but not so close as to crowd. The room's lamp made the brass fittings glow like old honey. The ticking sound continued, steady and calm, coming from a small mechanism mounted beside the telegraph apparatus, something that looked partly like a clockwork motor and partly like a music box without its lid. Vale looked up at the host. "The tapping at 12 and 7, he said. "Does it begin from here?" The older man's gaze drifted toward the mechanism, and for a moment his expression carried something like tenderness. "It begins," he said slowly, "where it is allowed to begin. Here. And then, elsewhere." Vale did not press further. He lowered his gaze again, focusing on the marks in his notebook. "I wrote what I heard," he said, more to Elias than to the host. "As short and long, as clusters and rests. It has the discipline of a code." Elias watched Vale's pencil hover over the page, as if deciding where to touch down. "A telegraph code," Elias murmured. and the thought felt both obvious and strangely beautiful. It meant the sound was not merely rhythmic, it was structured. It meant it could be translated, though Elias suspected that what would emerge might not be words in the ordinary sense. Vale began to copy the pattern again, more neatly, as though setting it into a clearer form. He divided the taps into short and long. He marked the pauses between them. He made small spaces where the longer rests fell, like the spaces between words. The host remained silent while Vale worked, his hands folded, his stance patient. Elias found himself breathing in time with the pencil's movement, the slow scratch on paper becoming its own quiet rhythm. When Vale finished, he looked at the sequence for a long moment, his eyes calm, his mind evidently turning the pattern over without strain. Then he spoke with the quiet certainty of someone naming what he has already known for some time. "Morse," he said. Elias felt a small thrill at the word. It was not fear. It was the simple pleasure of understanding. Morse code belonged to the city's hidden bloodstream. It carried news, orders, warnings, reunions. It was the language of distance made short. "Then the tapping is a message," Elias said. "Yes," Vale replied, "and no." He tapped the paper lightly. Morse can become letters. Letters can become words. But the way this is spaced is unusual. The rests are musical. The host's eyes flickered toward Vale with a guarded interest, as if he had not expected to be understood so quickly. Vale did not look up. He kept his attention on the pattern, and Elias realized that Vale was listening not only with his ears now, but with something deeper. An instinct for cadence, for the shape of calm. Vale began to translate, quietly, under his breath. Elias watched as he wrote letters above the dots and dashes, assembling them into fragments. Now and then he paused, not because he was stuck, but because he was noticing something. The letters did not form ordinary sentences. They did not gather into plain instruction. They looked almost like nonsense at first, scattered and incomplete. Yet when Vale read them aloud, softly, the sound of them carried a peculiar steadiness, as though they were meant less to be comprehended than to be felt. "It is not spelling," Vale said, and his voice was gentle with discovery. "It is counting." "Counting?" Elias repeated. "Counting beats," Vale answered. He placed his finger along the pattern again. Short, short, long, rest, a phrase, then another. It resembles the measure of verse, not the content, like a lullaby written in rhythm rather than in words. Elias stared at the page until his eyes softened and his attention shifted from meaning to motion. He began to sense it, the way one senses the structure of a poem, even without hearing the full line. There was a rocking quality to the arrangement. There was repetition, but not the dead repetition of a machine. It was the living repetition of breath, of waves, of a cradle rocked by patient hands. Vale leaned slightly closer to the telegraph apparatus itself. He examined the small clockwork mechanism mounted beside it, the one that ticked quietly. It was not standard equipment, not in the form Elias had seen in railway offices. It had been adapted, refined. The gears were clean. The springs looked cared for. Beside it lay a narrow strip of paper, thicker than ordinary, with small perforations running along it in a careful sequence, like the punched rolls used in certain automatic instruments. The strip was coiled neatly, as if ready to be fed through. Vale did not touch it without permission. He looked at the host instead. "You have made it automatic," he said softly. "A timed sequence." The older man's shoulders lifted and fell in a slow breath. "Time is the one thing everyone shares," he said. "Even those who feel alone in the dark." Elias felt those words settle in him with unusual warmth. He understood then why the sound arrived at 12 and 7. It was not arbitrary. It was a promise kept precisely, a ritual, a small, dependable kindness. Vale returned his gaze to the paper. "And the rhythm," he murmured, "is shaped like a lullaby." He spoke as if to himself, but Elias heard the deeper implication. If the rhythm was shaped, then someone had shaped it deliberately. Someone had taken a code meant for messages and taught it to soothe. Someone had looked at a city full of sleepless minds and decided to answer not with sermons or scolding, but with cadence. The host remained quiet, yet his stillness no longer felt defensive. It felt contemplative, as though the careful understanding in Vale's voice had eased something tight within him. The lamp flame made a small, steady sound. The clockwork ticked on. Outside, London continued its evening in softened tones, unaware of the gentle mechanics hidden behind the sealed door of Station M. Elias found himself standing in a room where technology and tenderness had been stitched together, where copper and dream met in the same patient rhythm. Vale closed his notebook slowly, not to end the moment, but to hold it. "It is a message," he said again, looking at the host with calm respect. "But it is a message to the body, not the intellect. It tells the mind it may loosen its grip. It tells the breath it may deepen. It tells the night it may be safe." For the first time, the older man's guarded expression softened into something almost like relief. He did not yet offer his name. He did not yet explain himself. But in the warm pool of lamplight, beside the quiet ticking mechanism, he seemed to accept that he had been seen, not as a suspicious figure in the dark, but as the maker of a kind and careful pattern. And Elias, watching, understood that the mystery they were unraveling was not the mystery of harm, but the mystery of mercy, translated into Morse and sent softly into the sleeping city. The room within Station M seemed to grow warmer, not because the air itself changed, but because understanding has a way of softening whatever it touches. Adrian Vale's words, spoken with calm respect, did not strike the older man like questions meant to corner him. They settled around him like a shawl laid gently across shoulders. For a while he said nothing, and the silence did not feel awkward. It felt necessary, like the pause between one phrase of music and the next. Dr. Elias Harrow stood quietly, taking in the details that now seemed more intimate than merely curious. The careful coiling of perforated paper, the clean oil sheen on certain gears, the way the lamp wick had been trimmed so its flame would not hiss too loudly. These were not the habits of someone careless or reckless. They were the habits of someone who valued quiet as a form of craft. The older man moved at last to a small side table and poured water from a kettle that rested near a low brazier. The kettle did not boil furiously. It simmered with restraint, as if even heat had been asked to behave. He made tea without ceremony, using a chipped teapot that looked as if it had belonged to the station long before the building closed its door to the street. He set 3 cups on the desk, their rims worn thin from use. The offering was simple, yet it carried a kind of invitation. If they were to speak, they would speak as people do in kitchens and sitting rooms, not as opponents across a barrier. Vale accepted a cup with a small nod. Elias did likewise. The tea was plain and slightly bitter, but it warmed the throat and steadied the hands. The older man sat in a chair near the telegraph apparatus, not as though he were guarding it, but as though he belonged beside it, like a pianist beside a familiar instrument. The lamp's warm circle of light held them together in the vast quiet of the room, and beyond it, the shelves and walls receded into softer shadows. "You have helped people," Vale said again gently, as if placing the statement where it could be safely held. "They did not know why, They only knew that rest returned. The older man watched the tea in his cup for a moment, as if reading his own reflection in the dark surface. When he spoke, his voice carried the careful slowness of someone who has not used it often for ordinary conversation. "I did not set out to be noticed," he said. "Notice leads to questions, and questions lead to interference." Elias leaned forward slightly, keeping his posture mild. "We are not here to interfere," he said. "At least, not in the way you fear. I am a physician. I have seen what sleeplessness does. It makes the body brittle. It makes the mind sharp in the wrong way. What you have done, however you have done it, has eased that." The man's gaze lifted toward Elias, and for the first time Elias saw something in his eyes that looked like a long-held sorrow, not dramatic, but steady. "Eased," the man repeated softly, as though the word itself were a relief. "Yes, that was the hope. Not to cure anything grand, just to ease." Vale did not ask for a name immediately. He did not ask for justification. He waited, allowing the older man the space to decide what to offer. It was one of Vale's quiet talents, Elias realized. He could create a room inside a conversation where another person could sit down and breathe. After a time, the older man set his cup down and rested his hands on his knees. His fingers were long and a little stiff, the fingers of someone who had pressed keys and levers for many years. "My name is Silas Marin," he said at last. He did not say it with pride or shame. He said it as a fact, like the station's letter M. "I worked here when it was not sealed, when it was full of voices, though we never spoke loudly." Vale inclined his head, acknowledging the gift of the name. "Mr. Marin," he said, "you were a telegraphist." "Yes." Silas's gaze drifted toward the apparatus, and his expression softened in a way that suggested both loyalty and regret. "A receiver mostly. A sender when needed. Night work, often. The kind of work where one hears life arriving in clicks. The kind of work where a message can make a man laugh or fall silent, and you never see his face, only the way his shoulders change." Elias felt the truth of that settle into him. He had known men who carried the weight of what they witnessed, not because anyone told them to, but because the mind does not easily set down what it has received with full attention. Silas's hands, resting now, looked as if they had once been very fast. Elias imagined those hands in younger years, moving quickly over keys, catching rhythms, translating them into words that changed lives far away. Silas continued, slowly, as if choosing each detail for its gentleness. "There were years," he said, "when the city's nights were full of messages that did not allow sleep. Accidents, illness, the kind of news that arrives too late to prevent anything. During the epidemic, I sat here and received names, so many names, sometimes only names, sometimes only the word gone. Sometimes a request for a doctor when it was already past the hour a doctor could help. He did not linger on the sorrow. He did not paint it in harsh color. Yet the room seemed to hear it anyway, in the way the lamp flame leaned slightly in its shade, in the way the ticking mechanism continued, as if to keep time through memory. Elias felt his throat tighten, not with distress, but with quiet sympathy. He understood now that Station M was not simply an abandoned building. It was a place that had held human grief and human hope in equal measure. Translated into pulses, Silas lifted his eyes, and for a moment they looked almost apologetic. "When you sit with messages like that," he said, "night after night, you begin to hear them even when the key is silent. You go home, and the walls of your room feel like they might start tapping. Your mind learns the rhythm of bad news. It expects it. It listens for it. Elias's physician's mind recognized the shape of what Silas described. The body remembers. The nerves learn patterns. A person can be safe and still feel the echo of danger. "And you could not sleep," Elias said softly, not as an assumption, but as an invitation. Silas's mouth tightened briefly, then relaxed. "I could sleep," he admitted, "but not kindly, not deeply. I would wake with the sound in my head. I would wake as if the key had called my name." Vale's voice was calm. "So you decided to change the sound," he said. Silas looked down at his hands again, then back at the small clockwork mechanism beside the telegraph key. "When the station closed," he said, "they left much behind. The city moves on. It does not always collect its old bones. They shut the door. They locked it. They forgot it. I did not forget." His fingers lifted slightly, hovering near the mechanism without touching it, as if he were greeting an old friend. "I came back, at first, just to sit, to be in a place that understood the language of night. It was quiet here then, and the quiet was a relief. But the quiet also felt wasted, like a room with a fire laid, but never lit." Elias could almost see it. Silas slipping into the sealed station at dusk, sitting alone among desks and ledgers, letting the old walls hold him without question. In such solitude, the mind tends to speak louder. Perhaps Silas had sought a sound to answer it. Perhaps he had sought a rhythm to replace the harsh one his nerves had learned. Silas's voice grew steadier, as if saying the next part aloud made it more real. "I began to experiment," he said. "Not with words. Words are too sharp. They can cut. Even kind words can cut if they arrive at the wrong moment. I thought instead of cadence, of breath, of the way a lullaby does not argue with a child's fear. It simply holds the fear and rocks it until it grows tired." Vale's gaze softened. "You turned a telegraph into a cradle," he said, and there was no mockery in it, only appreciation. Silas gave a small, almost reluctant nod. "I had once used the key to carry endings," he said. "I wanted, for once, to carry beginnings, or at least pauses, places where the mind could rest." He gestured toward the perforated paper strip. "I made patterns. I tested them on myself. If my breath slowed, I kept them. If my mind resisted, I changed them. It took time. It took patience. It took many nights. But eventually, at 12 and 7, when the city is quiet enough to hear its own pulse, I found a rhythm that seemed to lay a hand on the nerves and say gently, 'You may let go now.'" Elias felt a warmth behind his eyes, the kind that comes not from sentimentality, but from recognition. This was not a man chasing attention. This was a man trying to mend something invisible. In a world where kindness is often noisy, Silas's kindness had been precise and silent, sent through wires like a secret blessing. "And you sent it out," Vale said, his tone still mild. "Beyond these walls." Silas's gaze drifted upward, toward the place where the lines disappeared into the wall. "The lines were there," he said simply. "Old lines, still connected in places, like veins that still carry something if the heart remembers how to beat. I did not plan where it went. I did not choose homes. I only let the rhythm travel. Perhaps it found those who were listening. Perhaps it found those whose sleeplessness made them sensitive to any sign of steadiness." Vale sat back slightly, as if allowing the story to settle. Elias noticed that, in speaking, Silas's shoulders had lowered. His hands no longer hovered tensely. He looked, for the first time, almost relieved, as though confession, if it could be called that, had lightened a burden. Vale's calm presence had made the revealing safe. There was a pause, and in it, the station seemed to breathe. The clockwork mechanism ticked. The lamp flame held steady. Outside, London's night deepened, and the city's unseen sleepers prepared to meet the familiar rhythm at 12 and 7. "I feared," Silas said quietly, "that if anyone found out, they would stop it. They would call it tampering. They would call it trespass. They would call it—" He searched for the word, and the searching itself sounded tired. "Strange." Vale leaned forward, his eyes clear. "The world often calls what it does not understand strange," he said, "and sometimes it is right, but strange is not the same as harmful. We are here because we noticed the gentleness, not because we sought a culprit." Silas looked at him for a long moment, and then something softened further, like a knot loosening. "Then perhaps," he said, "you have come at the right pace." Elias felt the quiet truth of that. They had followed the sound slowly. They had listened before they spoke. They had knocked before they entered. They had treated a hidden kindness with the same care one would give a sleeping child. In that careful approach, something had been preserved. Vale's gaze moved again to the perforated paper and the clockwork motor. "Will you show us," he asked, "how the lullaby is made?" Silas did not answer immediately, but he reached out at last and placed his fingers on the edge of the paper strip. The gesture was so gentle it was almost a caress. In the warm circle of lamplight, in the quiet heart of Station M, the maker of quiet things prepared to reveal the craft of his tenderness. Silas Marin handled the perforated paper as if it were both machine part and manuscript, something practical and something tender at once. Under the modest lamp flame, the little holes in the strip looked like a constellation pressed into cream-colored card, a pattern that could guide a mechanism and, through that mechanism, guide a mind. He drew the strip forward a few inches, then paused, as though listening to it with his fingertips. Adrian Vale watched without impatience. Dr. Elias Harrow found himself watching Silas's hands more than the apparatus, because the hands revealed what the heart intended. They moved with the slow confidence of someone who has spent a lifetime giving meaning to small sounds. "It is simple," Silas said quietly, though his voice suggested he did not mean easy. "The motor turns at a steady rate. The strip advances. The holes allow the contacts to close. The key clicks. The sounder answers. Short and long, with rests made by spaces where no hole is cut." He tapped the edge of the strip lightly. "The paper is my score." Vale nodded. "And you chose the measure," he said, "not the words." Silas's gaze went distant for a moment, as if he were looking not at paper, but at memory. "Words were my burden," he said. "So I began with the idea of not words. I thought, if I can make a person's breath slow, the person's thoughts will follow. A mind is not always convinced by reasoning, but it is often convinced by rhythm." Elias, whose work had taught him how closely breath and fear are linked, felt the truth in that. He had seen patients calm when their breathing changed, before their minds understood they were safe. The body, in its quiet intelligence, can be guided by something as simple as a repeated pattern. Yet what Silas had made was more than repetition. It was shaped. It contained kindness in its pauses. Silas set the strip down and rose from his chair. "There is something else," he said. His voice held a slight hesitation, as if he were stepping toward a private room within his own mind. "If you are to understand it, you must see what fed it." He moved toward the shelves, past the desks and ledgers, toward a section of the room where the lamp's light faded and the shadows held more dust. Elias noticed, as Silas walked, that he did not limp, yet there was a carefulness in his gait, as though he respected the quiet and did not wish to disturb it with heavy steps. He reached a cabinet that stood against the wall, its doors closed, its wood worn smooth where hands had opened it many times. For a moment, he rested his palm on the cabinet's surface, and Elias had the impression of a man touching a gravestone with affection rather than grief. Silas opened the cabinet slowly. Inside, rather than spare station supplies or obsolete forms, there were bundles of paper tied with string. The strings were of different colors, some plain twine, some faded ribbon, as if Silas had used whatever was available. Each bundle was labeled in a neat hand with dates and brief notes. Elias felt a quiet surprise bloom in him. It was not an archivist's collection. It was a keeper's collection. "These," Silas said softly, "are letters." Vale stepped closer, his expression calm and curious. "Sent?" he asked. Silas shook his head. "Never sent," he said. "Unsent. Unfinished. Some of them were written in the station's quiet hours, when the night had slowed and the messages had ceased for a time. Some were written at home. Some were written here after the closure, when I began to come back." His fingers hovered over one bundle as if deciding whether to lift it. "I wrote them because the messages I received could not be answered. You cannot answer a telegram that says gone, not in any way that reaches the person who sent it, but the mind tries. The mind wants to reply. So I replied on paper. I replied into the air." Elias felt an ache behind his ribs, not sharp, but deep. He understood at once that these letters were not merely personal indulgence. They were attempts at repair, at balance. A man who has heard too much sorrow in clicks might need to put gentleness back into the world in whatever form he can manage, even if no one reads it. Silas lifted a bundle and placed it on the nearest desk in the lamplight's edge. He untied the string with careful fingers. The letters inside were folded neatly, each one addressed in a practiced hand, though the addresses were sometimes incomplete or replaced with phrases rather than names. To the mother who waited, to the man who asked for a doctor too late, to the one who blamed himself. Elias felt a hush move through him as he read those headings. They were not sentimental. They were honest. They acknowledged the shapes of suffering without dramatizing them. Vale did not reach for the papers without invitation. He simply looked. "These are the emotions," he said quietly. "The raw material." Silas's gaze stayed on the letters, and his voice softened further. "I did not keep them to indulge sorrow," he said. "I kept them because, when I wrote them, my breath changed, my shoulders lowered, my mind stopped racing. It was as if the act of shaping words I could not send, took something sharp and made it smoother." He paused, then added, "It is a strange thing to discover that the body can be calmed by making meaning, even if the meaning is never delivered." Elias nodded slowly. As a physician, he had watched patients mend when they were heard, even if no remedy was immediately given. The nervous system relaxes when it believes it has been witnessed. Perhaps these letters had witnessed Silas's own burden, and in witnessing it, they had begun to convert it into something gentler. Silas moved to another shelf and drew out a second bundle, tied with ribbon that had once been blue. He untied it and spread a few pages on the desk. These were different. The handwriting was the same, but the tone, even on the page, felt lighter, as though written with a steadier hand. Here were letters of gratitude, to a nurse, to a rail porter, to an unknown woman who had brought tea to the station on a bitter night. Here were apologies, to a man whose message Silas had misheard, to a family whose telegram he had delayed by minutes because his hands were shaking. The subjects were small, but the attention given to them was immense, and Elias realized that Silas had been collecting not only sorrow, but also kindness, and that the collection was his way of keeping London's heart from being too heavy. Vale's eyes moved gently over the papers, and then, as if the connection had been waiting, he looked back toward the telegraph mechanism. "You did not build the lullaby from mathematics alone," he said. "You built it from these." Silas's fingers trembled faintly, then steadied as he rested them on the desk's edge. "I did not know it at first," he admitted. "I thought it was only timing, only breath. But some patterns felt cold. They slowed the breathing, yes, but they did not soften the mind. Others," he gestured toward the letters, "others carried warmth. They carried, I do not know how to say it, a kind of human shape. So I began to notice what I was thinking when those patterns emerged. Often it was after writing one of these, after feeling remorse or gratitude or the quiet wish that someone, somewhere, might be held more gently." Elias felt his own mind begin to follow the thread. Silas had written letters he could not send, and those letters contained the honest contours of compassion. Then he had translated the emotional contour, not the content, into rhythm, not words, but cadence shaped by feeling. That was why the tapping soothed. It was not merely mechanical. It was human, filtered through a machine. Silas gathered a few pages and held them closer to the lamp, reading a line silently as if re-entering the moment of its writing. His lips moved faintly. He looked up again, and in his eyes Elias saw something like a plea, not for forgiveness, but for understanding that his work came from necessity. "There are people in this city," Silas said, "who do not receive letters of comfort. They do not have anyone who writes to them with tenderness. They fall asleep to the sound of other people's shouting. They wake to the sound of other people's boots on stairs. I could not give them much. I could not give them money. I could not give them safety. But I could give them a rhythm that says, 'You may rest now. You are not required to fight the night alone.'" Vale's expression remained composed, yet Elias sensed a quiet admiration in him. Vale did not flatter. He did not make grand gestures of praise, yet his attention itself was a kind of tribute. "And you chose 12 and 7, Vale said, "because it is a hinge in the night, late enough that the city has mostly quieted, early enough that the sleepless still have hope." Silas's mouth softened, that almost smile returning. "Yes," he said, "and because it was once the time we changed shifts here, a small ritual. The station always paused then, even in the busiest years. It seemed fitting." They sat for a time with the letters spread out like soft evidence, not of wrongdoing, but of longing. Elias noticed that the bundles were arranged with care, as if Silas had created a library inside the sealed station. A library not for readers, but for a man's own gentle reckoning with what he had heard. It felt to Elias like an altar of paper. Each letter was an offering. Each was an attempt to restore balance to a world that had sent too much grief down the wires. Outside, the fog pressed gently against the building, and the city's lamps made pale halos in the darkness. Inside, the lamp flame remained low, the clockwork motor ticked, and the telegraph apparatus waited like a patient mouth. Vale's gaze moved between the unsent letters and the perforated paper strip, and Elias saw in his face the calm certainty of a pattern finally understood. The lullaby, hidden in Morse, had been born not from eccentricity, but from a deep, quiet compassion, translated with careful hands into a language the body could hear. Silas began, slowly, to retie one bundle, then paused. He looked at Vale and Elias as though weighing whether to share something further. "There is one bundle," he said, "that matters most. The first. The one that began it." He reached deeper into the cabinet and drew out a thinner packet, tied with plain twine. The label was older than the others. The ink faded. Silas held it for a moment without opening it, as if he were holding a fragile thing. Then he set it gently on the desk in the lamplight, and Elias felt with quiet certainty that whatever was inside would explain not only the lullaby's craft, but its original wound. Silas Marin did not open the thin packet at once. He sat with it in the lamplight as though allowing the paper to adjust to being seen, and in that small pause, Elias Harrow felt the true character of the man's secrecy. It was not the secrecy of deception. It was the secrecy of tenderness. Some things are hidden not because they are wrong, but because they are easily bruised by careless eyes. Adrian Vale remained still, his attention calm and unforcing, and Elias found his own breathing falling into the same gentle patience he had begun to associate with midnight and 7. When Silas finally untied the twine, he did so slowly, as though each loop were a knot in memory. Inside were only a few pages, folded and refolded, their creases softened by repeated handling. The first page bore no address, only a date written in ink that had browned slightly with age. Beneath it, in the careful hand of a man trained to be legible under pressure, were lines that did not attempt poetry. They attempted honesty. Elias did not read every word, and Vale did not ask him to. Silas himself read aloud only a portion, and even that portion he read softly, as if speaking to the paper rather than to his guests. It was a letter to a person who had never been able to receive it, a letter written after one of those nights when the telegraph key had delivered a message too late for mercy. Silas did not describe the event in graphic detail. He did not dwell on calamity. He spoke instead of what remained afterward, the ache of unanswered need, the desire to offer comfort when comfort was no longer useful, and the quiet vow that if he could not send help through the wire, he would send something else. "I could not change what had happened," Silas said, lowering the page. "But I could change what the wire carried afterward, even a little, even if it was only a rhythm that did not injure the heart." Vale's voice, when it came, was mild. "So the first lullaby was an answer," he said, "not to the message, but to the human body that had to live after receiving it." Silas nodded once, and the motion looked like relief. Elias realized then that the unsent letters were not merely drafts. They were the soil from which the midnight rhythm had grown. The lullaby was a practice of repair, performed again and again in tiny pulses, offered to a city that had grown accustomed to carrying its tension into bed. They did not stay in Station M until morning. Vale understood that the station had already given what it could for one night. Silas retied the packet and returned it to the cabinet with the care of a librarian shelving a rare volume. He extinguished the lamp and guided them back through the corridor, his steps quiet, his breath steady. When the door opened to the street again, the fog accepted them without comment, and the lamplight outside seemed gentler after the room's soft darkness. Vale thanked Silas simply. Elias did too. Silas did not reply with flourish. He only inclined his head, as though they had completed a small and private ceremony. The door closed, and Station M returned to its sealed stillness, holding within it the ticking heart of a mechanism and a man's long, patient compassion. Over the next days, Elias began to notice changes that could not be attributed to any single cause, and yet could not be dismissed as coincidence either. It was not that London transformed. London did not become a fairy tale city. The streets remained damp. The work remained heavy. The winter remained winter. But in the thin spaces between burdens, a new habit began to form, like a path worn gradually across grass by many quiet feet choosing the same gentle route. It began with sleep. as most true changes do. Elias heard it from patients who had once come to him with hollow eyes and trembling hands. Their reports were not miraculous. They were modest, and because they were modest, they carried the ring of truth. A seamstress who had been waking every hour now woke only once and returned to sleep without dread. A clerk who had carried his ledgers into bed now found his mind drifting away from columns of numbers at 12 and 7, as if someone had kindly closed the book for him. A young mother, pale with exhaustion, said her baby's restless crying softened into a steady breathing at the same familiar moment, and that she herself felt her shoulders loosen as if an invisible hand had unknotted them. Elias listened, asked careful questions, and found no signs of fever, no new tonics, no change in diet significant enough to explain the pattern. The only consistent factor was the quiet tapping, heard faintly and sometimes not consciously heard at all, yet felt by the body as a gentle invitation. When people sleep even a little better, the day meets them differently. Elias began to observe small shifts in the morning faces he passed on stairwells and in narrow lanes. The changes were not dramatic. They were almost embarrassingly ordinary. A man who used to bark at his daughter to hurry now waited while she tied her boot, his impatience softened by rest. A shopkeeper who had once snapped at a customer's uncertainty now guided the customer calmly to the right shelf. A pair of laborers sharing a crust of bread laughed at something small, and the laughter sounded less strained. These were not the sorts of stories that make headlines. They were the sorts that make life bearable. Vale, when Elias described these observations, did not smile broadly. Yet a quiet satisfaction lived in the stillness of his face. "A city is a nervous system," he said one evening as they sat in his rooms with a low fire and a dim lamp. "It responds to pressure. It holds tension. It can learn habits. If enough people are soothed, even slightly, the city's tone changes, not by decree, by accumulation." Elias found himself thinking of the lullaby as a kind of weather, not a storm, not a bright day, but a gentle humidity that loosened what had been clenched. He began to notice, too, that some people who never spoke of the tapping nevertheless seemed calmer in the mornings. They would not have named the cause. They might not even have heard it consciously, but their bodies behaved as if they had been given permission to rest. Elias knew that the mind can accept help without understanding it, the way skin accepts warmth without analyzing its source. The effect did not feel like enchantment in the childish sense. It felt like a practical kind of magic, the sort that grows from knowledge and care. Silas had taken a system meant for urgent communication and taught it to carry steadiness. He had translated human tenderness into pattern, and pattern, Elias realized, can be as powerful as language. A lullaby does not convince. It accompanies. It gives the mind something safer to hold than its own sharp thoughts. On one of Elias's rounds, he visited Mrs. Mallow again. The widow's hands still moved constantly, smoothing cloth, straightening cups, but the frantic edge had dulled. Her voice held less apology. She spoke of her boarder's sleep as one might speak of a household learning a new rhythm, a shared habit of letting the day end more kindly. "We still worry," she said, almost as if confessing it. But the worry does not swell so large in the dark. It seems to step back. It lets other things breathe. That night, Elias walked home slowly through fog that had thickened into velvet. The gaslights made soft moons along the street. He heard the distant clatter of a late carriage, the faint call of someone closing shop, the hush of footsteps behind him that belonged to no threat, only to another person heading home. London's usual noises were still there, but they felt less abrasive, as though the city itself had learned to turn down its own volume after midnight. At 12 and 7, in his own bed, Elias heard the tapping again. It was faint, as always, and yet it felt more woven into the night than before, as if the sound had become part of the city's sleeping architecture. Tap, pause, tap, tap, pause. The rhythm did not ask him to solve anything. It asked him only to be human for a moment, to let his breath grow deeper, to allow his thoughts to unhook themselves from their daily anxieties. His eyelids grew heavy, and in that heaviness, there was no struggle. Somewhere, behind the sealed door of Station M, Silas Marin's mechanism ticked on with patient devotion. Somewhere above the rooftops, old copper lines carried a pulse that was not a message of crisis, but a message of permission. And across London, quietly and without ceremony, the sleepless began to trust the night again, learning a new habit the way one learns to hum a tune, not by force, but by gentle repetition, until the body remembers that it was always meant to rest. For a time, it seemed as though the lullaby might simply continue, night after night, as quietly and faithfully as the turning of the seasons. London received it without asking questions, and that very unasking felt like part of its charm. Yet daylight has its own habits, and daylight is less forgiving than fog. In the morning hours, men with ledgers look for irregularities, clerks check schedules, inspectors follow their lists, and the city's machinery is expected to behave. A kindness sent through forgotten wires might be gentle, but it was still a signal, and signals have a way of being noticed when the world is fully awake. Elias Harrow first sensed the change not in the night, but in a small piece of paper pinned near the door of a shop he passed on his rounds. It was an ordinary notice, printed in tidy black type, announcing routine work on local lines and junctions. The wording was plain, almost dull, and yet Elias felt his attention catch as if a thread had snagged on a nail. There would be inspections. There would be repairs. There would be men climbing poles and opening boxes, tracing faults, checking continuity, tidying what had been neglected. Elias stood a moment longer than he needed to, reading the notice twice, then folding the unease it stirred into his coat pocket along with his gloves. That evening, he brought the paper to Adrian Vale. Vale read it once, then again, not because he had missed anything, but because he was listening for what it implied beneath the simple language. The room was warm, the fire low, the lamp shaded, and outside, the fog moved along the street like a quiet animal. Vale placed the notice on the table beside his notebook, and for a while, he said nothing at all. Elias watched the stillness settle over him and recognized it as thought, not hesitation. "They will find him," Elias said softly, meaning Silas Marin, and the words felt heavier than their volume. "They may," Vale replied, equally soft, "or they may find only an anomaly and follow it with impatience." Elias pictured daylight hands tugging at old lines, opening Station M's sealed panels, frowning at an unexpected pulse. He imagined a supervisor with a stiff collar and a sharper voice declaring it interference, declaring it unlawful use, declaring it a nuisance. Silas's work was gentle, but the world's response to what it cannot categorize is rarely gentle. The very secrecy that had protected the lullaby might, in the wrong light, make it appear suspicious. Vale's gaze rested on the notice again. "The problem is not only discovery," he said. "It is consent." Elias frowned slightly. "Consent?" Vale leaned back in his chair, the movement unhurried. "A lullaby offered to the sleepless is kind," he said, "but it travels into homes without being invited by each household. Many would welcome it, yes. Some may not. We have been charmed by its benefit. Daylight forces us to consider whether benefit alone is enough. Elias understood the point with the sober clarity of his profession. A medicine can heal and still require permission. A soothing influence can be soothing and still deserve choice. The city had accepted the rhythm without knowing what it was, but acceptance born of ignorance is not the same as acceptance born of willingness. And there is safety, Elias added. Old lines, old mechanisms, if an inspector meddles or if the system surges. Vale nodded. Precisely. A kindness that depends on frail infrastructure is a kindness always at risk of being broken by accident. If we value it, we should not leave it at the mercy of routine repairs. They went to Station M the following evening, not as conspirators, but as careful friends carrying an uncomfortable truth. The fog lay low. Gaslights made pale pools of warmth along the street. The station's blank facade looked much as it always had, sealed and patient. When the door opened a crack, Silas Marin's eyes appeared first, cautious as ever, then softened when he recognized them. He let them in without the earlier suspicion, as if trust, once placed, could become a habit. Inside, the station held its familiar stillness. Silas lit the lamp low. The clockwork mechanism ticked. The perforated paper sat ready, coiled like a quiet promise. Elias felt again the tenderness of the place, the way it seemed to exist in a different tempo than the street outside. Yet the notice in Elias's pocket felt like a discordant note, and he drew it out with reluctance, as one might present a letter bearing unwelcome news. Silas read the notice with a steady face. When he finished, he set it down carefully and stared at the desk as if the grain of the wood might offer counsel. "So they will tidy the bones," he said at last, and his voice carried no bitterness, only resignation. "The city always returns to its lists." Vale's tone remained calm. "It is their work," he said, "and in their work they may find yours." Silas's hands folded and unfolded once, a small sign of strain. "I have been careful," he murmured. "I chose lines that were forgotten. I sent softly. I thought softness would keep it beneath notice." "Softness helps," Vale agreed, "but regularity is noticeable. Midnight and 7 is a vow. Vows can be traced." Silas's eyes drifted toward the apparatus. For a moment, he looked older, not in body, but in spirit, as though the thought of losing this practice pressed on him more heavily than any fear for himself. Elias sensed that for Silas, the lullaby was not merely a project, it was a way of staying whole. "I do not want to stop," Silas said quietly. "And you may not need to," Vale replied, "but you may need to change the method." Silas looked at him, waiting. Vale moved with unhurried deliberation to the desk where the perforated paper lay. He did not touch it. He simply regarded it as one regards a fragile instrument. "Your mechanism is sound," he said. "Your patterns are sound. The difficulty is the broadcast. The difficulty is that your kindness rides on a network that belongs to Daylight administration, and Daylight will eventually assert its ownership." Silas's shoulders lowered slightly, as if hearing the problem named plainly made it less frightening. "Then what would you have me do?" he asked, and the question carried a weary honesty. "I am one man. I have only this place. I have only these hands." Elias found himself speaking before Vale did, his voice gentle but firm with conviction. "You have already done something extraordinary," he said. "But it should not depend on secrecy alone. If it can be made to travel by choice, if it can be carried into a room intentionally, it would be safer. And perhaps even kinder." Silas's brow creased. "Carried?" Vale nodded, his eyes clear. "A smaller instrument," he said. A private one. Your timed motor, your punched paper, but housed as a music box might be housed. Something that can sit on a bedside table or a hospital shelf. Something that does not require tapping into lines that inspectors will eventually reclaim. Silas was quiet for a long moment. The ticking mechanism filled the space between them, steady as breath. It would lose the reach, he said at last. It would no longer drift through walls. It would not find the sleepless who do not know to ask. That is true, Vale said, but what it gains is consent. What it gains is durability, and what it gains is the chance to be shared by hands rather than stolen by wires. Elias watched Silas's face soften and tighten in small waves, like a man weighing two kinds of sorrow. The sorrow of stopping and the sorrow of narrowing what had been wide. He understood the conflict. A broad kindness feels beautiful, but a safe kindness lasts longer. There is another difficulty, Silas said quietly. If I stop sending it through the lines, some will notice the absence. They will not know why, but they will feel the night sharpen again. Vale's response was calm, almost tender. Then we do not stop abruptly, he said. We taper. We allow the city to adjust. The rhythm itself teaches the body. It will not vanish from memory in a single night. Elias found that thought comforting. Habits once learned remain in the muscles. A few weeks of better sleep can teach the nervous system a new path toward calm. The city had already begun to change in small ways. Perhaps it would not collapse back into sleeplessness if the source became more discreet. Silas looked down at his hands, then up again, as if seeing them differently. A music box, he murmured, the phrase tasting unfamiliar. A private station. Vale allowed a small pause before answering, as if giving Silas room to claim the idea as his own. Not private in the sense of hoarded, he said. Private in the sense of chosen. Offered where it is welcomed. Used where it is needed. Silas nodded slowly. The motion was reluctant, but it was real. And who would carry it? He asked. Elias thought of Clara Wren in the night surgery, of Mrs. Mallow and her lodging house, of Gideon Pike near the river, of all the quiet people who understood the value of small mercies. People who already hold the night gently, he said. Those who work when others sleep. Those who know how to keep a room calm, Vale added softly. A few at first. Trusted hands. Not a grand distribution. A careful one. The lamp flame leaned in its shade. The station's shelves receded into soft shadow. Silas looked once more at the telegraph apparatus that had been his companion through grief and repair. His fingers hovered near it, not touching, as if saying farewell to a habit that had carried him. When he finally spoke again, his voice held a steadier acceptance, like a man stepping onto a bridge after testing its strength. Then we will build it, Silas said. We will make the lullaby small enough to survive daylight. Vale inclined his head, satisfied, but not triumphant. Elias felt a quiet easing in his chest. The problem of daylight had been named, and naming it had not destroyed the kindness. It had refined it. Outside, London's evening continued in its softened tones, and inside Station M, 3 men sat within a pool of lamplight, planning not a grand rescue, but a careful preservation, so that the city's new habit of rest might continue, not as a secret signal in vulnerable wires, but as a chosen comfort carried gently from hand to hand. The work of making something smaller is often more delicate than the work of making something large. Silas Marin had once overseen the flow of messages that raced outward through a web of copper lines. He had been a custodian of reach. Now, with daylight pressing at the edges of his quiet practice, he became a custodian of intimacy. In the weeks that followed their conversation in Station M, the sealed building did not become busy, but it did become quietly purposeful. The lamp was lit a little more often. The kettle warmed a little more frequently. The ticking mechanism continued, and beside it, new parts began to appear. A small wooden case found at a market stall, thin brass hinges, soft felt for padding, a set of screws laid in careful rows, as if each were a word in an unspoken sentence. Adrian Vale visited when he could, never arriving with a flourish, never turning the station into a stage. He brought what was needed without making it feel like charity. A tiny hand drill, a file, a few pieces of wire that were newer than the old lines yet flexible enough to be shaped. Dr. Elias Harrow came as well, often in the evenings after his rounds, and found that the station's quiet industriousness soothed him in a way he had not expected. There was something deeply calming about craftsmanship undertaken for kindness. It asked the mind to focus without tightening. It turned worry into careful action. Silas worked with the patient concentration of someone who has learned to live in small increments of progress. He measured twice. He trimmed slowly. He tested connections with the same respect he had once given urgent messages, though now the urgency was replaced by steadiness. He dismantled the old clockwork motor only enough to understand it better, then reassembled it with soft felt beneath certain parts so that the ticking would remain present but gentle. He adjusted the tension so the mechanism would not snap into a harsh tempo. He experimented with cases, rejecting those whose lids shut too loudly, whose hinges squeaked, whose wood smelled of sharp varnish rather than warm, lived-in resin. When he found a case that pleased him, he rubbed the wood with a small cloth until it shone softly in lamplight, not glossy, but comforting, like a well-kept bedside table. Vale watched Silas's choices with quiet approval. "You are not making a device," he said one evening as Silas tested a new arrangement of gears. "You are making an experience." Silas did not look up at once. "Yes," he said after a moment. "A device can be tolerated. An experience can be welcomed." Elias, seated nearby with his medical bag at his feet, listened and felt the truth of that in his bones. The lullaby, as it traveled through wires, had been a kind of benevolent weather. It had touched many without asking. Now it would become something closer to a cup of tea offered at midnight, an act that required a hand to offer and a hand to accept. In time, the first small instrument was finished. It resembled a music box in size and shape, though its purpose was different and its voice more restrained. The lid opened with a soft, satisfying resistance and closed with a cushioned hush. Inside, the perforated paper strip sat in a neat channel, ready to feed through the mechanism. The telegraph key itself, reduced and refined, had been mounted so that its sound became less sharp, more like the gentle tick of rain on a pane. Silas had padded the base with felt so vibrations would not carry harshly through wood or stone. When the motor engaged, the motion was almost invisible, a quiet turning that suggested the work of time rather than the work of force. Silas placed the finished box on the desk in Station M and looked at it for a long moment without touching it, as though he were meeting a new creature he had helped into being. His face, usually guarded, held a small openness that Elias found moving. "It is strange," Silas said softly. "I spent my life with loud consequences. Now I am making something whose consequence is silence." Vale's voice was gentle. "Silence," he said, "is not nothing. It can be a gift." They did not distribute the lullaby widely. They did not announce it. They chose only a few people, and the choosing itself was careful. Elias suggested Clara Wren at St. Bridget's night surgery because she understood the rhythms of restless bodies and knew how to offer comfort without making it a spectacle. He suggested Mrs. Mallow because her lodging house held people whose lives were crowded and whose nights were often sharp with worry. Vale suggested Gideon Pike, the lamplighter, because Gideon moved through the city's dark hours as a familiar presence and carried a natural steadiness with him. They did not choose the wealthy, not out of disdain, but out of simple practicality. Those who could afford quiet already had more of it than they realized. The lullaby's purpose was to touch those whose rest was most fragile. The first delivery was to St. Bridget's. Elias accompanied Silas and Vale, not because he was necessary, but because he wanted the act to feel supported. They arrived in the late evening when the ward's lamplight was low and the corridors held the hush of careful footsteps. Clara Wren greeted them with a look that was both curious and kind. She did not ask for explanations that would have forced Silas into defensive speech. She simply led them into the small sitting room where she had first pointed to the old lines by the window. Silas placed the box on the table and opened it with gentle fingers. "It is a rhythm," he said, keeping his voice low. "It will begin at 12 and 7 if you wind it here." He showed her the small key. "It is not medicine. It is not a trick. It is only an offered steadiness. Use it if it helps. Put it away if it does not." Clara watched, then rested her palm on the box lid as if greeting it. Her expression softened. "In this work," she said quietly, "anything that calms without taking is precious." They waited until midnight in the sitting room, with the ward beyond it breathing in its uneven chorus. When 12 and 7 arrived, Clara wound the key and the mechanism began. The tapping emerged, soft as ever, but now contained, close, a little heart beating on a table rather than across a city's wires. Elias listened and felt his own chest loosen. The sound did what it had always done. It offered a pattern sturdy enough for the mind to lean upon. The change in the ward was subtle, but it was there. A patient who had been shifting stopped shifting. A cough in the distance softened and became less anxious. Even Clara's posture altered, her shoulders dropping by a fraction as if the rhythm had reminded her that she was allowed to be a person, not only a caretaker. Silas watched with quiet intensity, and Elias saw in his eyes a kind of relief that had nothing to do with pride. It was relief that the lullaby could live beyond the wires, that the kindness could be chosen and still remain effective. After that night, the practice spread in the way gentle customs spread. Slowly, through trust, through small recommendations, through the quiet confidence of people who have tried something and found it useful. Clara used the box for certain patients who were frightened by sleeplessness, and she did so not as a cure, but as a comfort. Mrs. Mallow used it in her lodging house, placing it on the landing outside the rooms of those who worked late, winding it at 12 and 7 like a ritual, then closing the lid with care. Gideon Pike carried the rhythm in another way. He did not take a box. He learned the pattern, tapping it softly with his fingers on a wooden rail when he made his rounds, letting the cadence accompany him like a private hymn. This was the true transformation, Elias realized. The lullaby was becoming human again. It was moving from mechanism to ritual, from secret broadcast to chosen practice. The city was no longer being soothed by an invisible signal it did not understand. It was being soothed by people offering one another a measured kindness, a rhythm shared the way bread is shared when the night feels long. Vale observed these developments with a calm satisfaction that rarely moved his features. "It will endure longer this way," he said one evening to Elias as they walked together beneath fog-softened lamps. "Not because it is hidden, because it is held." Elias thought of Silas Marin in Station M, winding the key, trimming paper, tying letters with string. He thought of Clara's steady hands, of Mrs. Mallow's careful rituals, of Gideon's quiet taps against wood in lamplight. He felt, in all of it, a tenderness that extended beyond the lullaby's sound. The city, so often portrayed as harsh, was learning a new habit of gentleness, and that habit did not belong to wires or buildings. It belonged to people, passed quietly from hand to hand like a warm cup offered at midnight. The winter did not end with a sudden softening, but it began to loosen in small, almost unremarkable ways. The fog still came, yet it often arrived with a lighter touch. The mornings still held their chill, yet sunlight sometimes found a narrow path between clouds and rested briefly on brickwork, warming it like a palm laid gently against a cheek. London continued to be London, with its errands and worries, its soot and steam, its rich and poor moving past one another with familiar distance. And yet, beneath the city's ordinary weight, a quieter rhythm persisted, not as a secret signal in vulnerable wires, but as a practice carried by human hands. The lullaby had become less like weather and more like habit, and habit, once learned, can outlast the circumstances that first taught it. Elias Harrow noticed that even his own evenings had changed. He still read by lamplight, still listened to the building settle, still heard the occasional carriage pass on damp wheels. Yet the sharp edge of constant alertness, the feeling that the night might demand something of him, had softened. He saw that softness in others as well. In Clara Wren's steadier eyes when she came for supplies, in Mrs. Mallow's calmer voice when she spoke of her boarders, in Gideon Pike's easy patience as he lit the lamps and moved along the street as though he were guiding darkness into gentler shapes. The lullaby boxes had found their places in a few quiet corners, and the tapping pattern had found its way into a few human memories. It lived now in bedrooms and wards and lodging house landings, offered without drama, accepted without obligation. Daylight inspections did come, as Vale had predicted, moving through neighborhoods with their lists and measurements. Men climbed poles. Junction boxes were opened. Old lines were traced and sorted. In due time, a clerk noticed that Station M's area was strangely quiet and strangely tidy for a place long sealed. It might have become a problem. It might have become a confrontation. Yet when the inspectors reached the convergence of old wires, they found only what looked like ordinary obsolescence, lines that no longer carried regular traffic, connections that had been gradually loosened and redirected. Vale and Silas had been careful. They had not severed anything violently or abruptly. They had simply allowed the old network to sleep, as though it had reached the end of its useful work and deserved rest. This careful tapering was not merely technical, it was also emotional. Silas Marin had insisted on it, and Elias understood why. One does not remove a comfort from a frightened body without notice. One lets the body learn that it can carry the comfort within itself. Over several weeks, the midnight tapping traveling through the old lines grew softer, then rarer, then finally absent. Some who had never known its source felt only a faint disappointment, as one feels when a familiar song stops playing in a shop. Others did not notice at all, because the habit of calmer breath had already taken root. The lullaby had done what lullabies do. It had accompanied the mind until the mind remembered how to settle on its own. Yet Silas did not wish the change to pass without acknowledgement, at least within the small circle of those who had understood. He invited Vale and Elias to Station M one last time, not to hide anything, but to close the practice as one closes a well-loved book. They arrived on an evening when the fog was thin and the lamps shone with unusual clarity, their halos smaller. as if the air itself had become less burdened. The station's door opened with familiar reluctance, and Silas's quiet face appeared, a little paler in lamplight than it had been at first, not from illness, but from the gentle strain of a long transition. Inside, Station M looked much as it always had, yet different in the way a room looks different after furniture is moved. The telegraph apparatus remained, but the lines leading outward had been neatly disconnected and coiled, tagged in Silas's careful handwriting, as though he were laying a sleeping child's toys back in their proper place. Several of the small lullaby boxes were gone now, already placed in their chosen homes. The cabinet of unsent letters remained, and Elias sensed that it always would. Some kinds of archives are not meant for public use. They are meant to keep a person whole. Silas lit the lamp low and set 3 cups on the desk, the same chipped teapot, the same plain tea. Vale accepted the cup. Elias did too. The station's stillness gathered around them like a familiar blanket. The clockwork mechanism beside the telegraph key ticked softly, and the sound felt almost affectionate, like a small creature breathing in sleep. "I wanted," Silas said after a quiet moment, "to send it once more." Vale did not ask why. He understood the instinct. Ritual gives the nervous system a closing, and without closing the mind can keep searching for the old signal, like a hand patting an empty pocket. Elias felt a tenderness in his chest, recognizing that Silas's desire was not to reclaim reach, but to offer a farewell shaped like gratitude. Silas set a fresh perforated strip into the mechanism. It was shorter than the usual midnight roll. Elias noticed that the holes were arranged with particular symmetry, as if Silas had composed a final phrase that would not wander. Vale watched without speaking, his gaze steady and respectful. When the strip was in place, Silas wound the key with slow care. The motor engaged with a quiet, patient turning. They did not wait until midnight. They did not need to. This sending was not for the whole city. It was for the room itself, for the small circle of those who had listened closely enough to understand. The tapping began, delicate and familiar, short taps and longer pauses, the cadence that had soothed so many bodies. Yet Elias heard within it a difference. The pattern was simpler. The rests were longer. It felt like a hand smoothing a blanket one last time, pressing out the creases, then lifting away. Silas watched the sounder with calm attention as it clicked. His face held no triumph. It held something quieter, a kind of peaceful accountability. When the last cluster of taps ended, the mechanism did not stop abruptly. It eased into silence, and the silence that followed felt shaped, not empty. Elias realized in that moment that the station itself seemed to relax, as though it had been holding a breath for years and had finally let it out. Silas reached to the apparatus and, with the gentlest motion, disengaged the motor. He removed the strip and set it aside. Then, without hurry, he opened a drawer and took out a small envelope. He placed it on the desk and slid it toward Vale. "What is it?" Vale asked, his voice as calm as ever. "A blank roll," Silas said. "Unpunched, unwritten." His eyes flicked toward the cabinet of letters, then back. "You taught me, in your way, that what matters most is not hiding a kindness, but holding it carefully. This is not a request. It is only a symbol. A reminder that patterns can be made from gentleness." Vale looked at the envelope a long moment, then placed his hand lightly on it. "Thank you," he said. And in those 2 words, Elias heard something rare. Admiration expressed plainly, without ornament. After they left Station M, the city greeted them with a quiet that felt earned. The fog was thin. The lamps shone steadily. The street seemed wider, not because it had changed, but because their minds were less crowded. They walked in silence for several blocks, not uncomfortable, simply settled. When they reached Vale's building, Vale did not immediately turn toward his door. He paused at the street corner where lamplight pooled, and he looked out across the sleeping rooftops as though listening for a sound that was no longer traveling through copper. "It is an interesting thing," Vale said at last, and his voice was low, measured. "How easily a mind can be sharpened by pain, and how rarely we consider that it can be softened by care with the same precision." Elias stood beside him, feeling the truth of that statement like warmth in the chest. He thought of his patients and their steadier mornings. He thought of Clara's ward quieting without fear. He thought of Mrs. Mallow winding the little box with the seriousness of a prayer. He thought of Gideon tapping the rhythm against wood as he walked through lamplight. A city had not been saved. It had been soothed, and perhaps that was enough. Perhaps in the long ledger of human living, small mercies written in rhythm were not minor at all. Vale's gaze remained on the rooftops for a moment longer, then drifted toward the window of his rooms, where a single lamp waited behind a curtain. "Come," he said softly. "You should sleep, Dr. Harrow. The night asks nothing more of you." Elias nodded, and when they parted, he walked home with a steadiness he had not known in earlier winters. In his room, he washed his hands, set his bag down, and drew the curtains. The building settled around him. The air was cool and clean. He lay beneath the covers and allowed his breath to lengthen, not because a wire commanded it, but because his body remembered the practice of letting go. Somewhere in London, in a lodging house, in a ward, in a quiet room with a small wooden box, the lullaby might still be offered by a caring hand. Somewhere else, nothing tapped at all, and yet someone still slept, because the mind had learned the way. And if you, too, are listening in the hush of night, may your thoughts grow softer at the edges. May your breathing deepen as gently as a tide returning. May every worry loosen its grip and drift away like fog thinning at dawn. May your body feel safe, your mind feel held, and sleep come to you now, steady, quiet, and kind, until you rest in a deep, peaceful darkness that asks nothing of you but to be.